emerged from the ruins, fueled by industrial might. But the prosperity was the fragile peace of the 1930s is shattering. Across the globe,
the eyes of the world are upon us. We will not back down.
World War II did not erupt in a single moment. It was the result of decades of unresolved tensions, global political failures, and emotional wounds left behind by World War I. After Germany's defeat in 1918, the Treaty of Versailles imposed extreme punishments. The treaty stripped Germany of territory, reduced its military to a powerless state, and forced it to pay enormous reparations. Factories closed, inflation went out of control, and ordinary people lost their savings overnight. The value of currency collapsed so badly that German citizens carried money in baskets just to buy bread. As hunger and despair spread, resentment against the treaty grew stronger. Germans felt humiliated and betrayed, searching for someone who could restore their dignity. In this climate of anger, the Weimar Republic, the democratic government created after WWII, struggled to survive. Political parties clashed violently, extremists marched openly in the streets, and citizens felt unprotected and abandoned. Adolf Hitler, a former soldier and an effective public speaker, exploited this chaos. Through fiery speeches, he promised to rebuild the nation, restore pride, and avenge the injustice of Versailles. He blamed Germany's defeat on internal enemies, used propaganda to shape public opinion, and slowly built a large movement, the Nazi Party. By 1933, using a mix of intimidation, manipulation, and legal loopholes, Hitler became chancellor. Within months, he destroyed political opposition, established a totalitarian regime, and began controlling every aspect of public and private life. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was equally unstable. The Great Depression of 1929 shattered global economies, causing mass unemployment, poverty, and fear. Nations turned inward, governments failed, and extremist ideologies looked increasingly appealing. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already created a fascist dictatorship, promoting aggression and military expansion. In Japan, military leaders gained control and launched campaigns to conquer territory in Asia, believing expansion was necessary for their survival. Britain and France, exhausted by the trauma of World War I, adopted a dangerous strategy called appeasement. They avoided confrontation with aggressive dictators. They hoped that if they allowed Germany to regain some power peacefully, another global war could be avoided. But this only encouraged Hitler. He rebuilt the German military in secret, then openly broke the treaty by reoccupying the Rhineland in 1936. No one stopped him. His confidence grew. In 1938, he annexed Austria. The world protested, but again, no one intervened. Later, he demanded the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, and the Munich Agreement handed it to him in hopes of protecting peace. But Hitler never intended peace. Every success made him more ambitious. Throughout the late 1930s, the world divided into uncertain alliances, mistrust grew across borders, and diplomacy collapsed. The final shock came in 1939. Germany and the Soviet Union, two ideological enemies, signed a non-aggression pact. They secretly agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. This ensured that Hitler would not face a two-front war, giving him the confidence to begin his plan for territorial domination. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland with overwhelming force, using blitzkrieg tactics, fast, coordinated attacks with tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry. Britain and France declared war. Within days, the deadliest conflict in human history had begun. When dawn broke on September 1, 1939, Europe awoke not to the sounds of morning life, but to the thunder of German artillery exploding across the Polish border. As tank divisions surged forward with terrifying speed and aircraft roared above in perfect coordination, executing the strategy Hitler called Blitzkrieg lightning war, a devastating blend of speed, power, and psychological shock designed to overwhelm nations, before they could even mobilize. Polish cities were bombed relentlessly, railways were shattered, communication lines were cut, and civilians fled through burning streets as the Wehrmacht advanced like a steel tide, leaving Europe stunned by the ferocity of Germany's new war machine, a force far deadlier and more modern than anything seen before. Britain and France, bound by treaties, declared war on Germany 2 days later, but their response was slow, confused, and cautious. The world watched as the Western Front fell into eerie silence, a period later called the Phony War, where soldiers sat in trenches waiting for a battle that never came, unaware that Hitler was preparing something far more ambitious. In the East, Poland faced an unexpected betrayal when the Soviet Union, acting under the secret clauses of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded from the other side, crushing any hope of Polish resistance and dividing the nation between two expanding empires. Marking the first grim victory born from the cooperation of dictators, the months that followed saw Europe holding its breath as Hitler planned his next moves. But in April 1940, he struck again, this time in Scandinavia, launching swift invasions of Denmark and Norway to secure strategic ports and iron supply routes. Denmark fell in hours, while Norway resisted fiercely but eventually succumbed, proving again that the German war machine was unmatched in speed and precision. Then in May 1940, Hitler unleashed his most daring campaign yet, an assault on Western Europe, but not through the fortified French Maginot Line. Instead, German tanks swept through the dense Ardennes forest, a region the Allies believed impenetrable, catching them completely off guard and breaking open France's defenses in days. Belgium and the Netherlands collapsed rapidly. British and French forces retreated in disarray, and as German troops advanced toward the coast, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers found themselves trapped at Dunkirk, surrounded by German divisions closing in from all sides. In an extraordinary moment of desperation and courage, a miraculous evacuation began. The British Navy, joined by civilian fishing boats and private vessels, crossed the English Channel under constant air attack, rescuing over 300,000 soldiers who would later form the backbone of the Allied comeback. Though the world understood the bitter truth, Dunkirk was a survival, not a victory. In June 1940, France, once thought undefeatable, crumbled under the relentless German advance. Paris fell, the government surrendered, and the nation was split into an occupied zone controlled by Germany and a puppet regime headquartered in Vichy, marking one of the darkest moments in French history as Hitler stood triumphant over Western Europe. With France defeated, Germany's dominance seemed absolute, and Britain stood alone as the last barrier between Hitler and complete European control, a solitary island defying the most powerful army on the continent. Hitler expected Britain to surrender, but when it refused, he turned to a new strategy, the Battle of Britain, aiming to destroy the Royal Air Force and pave the way for invasion. German bombers filled the skies, unleashing devastating air raids on airfields, factories, and eventually entire cities, igniting the London Blitz, where nights were illuminated by burning buildings, collapsing homes, and endless sirens echoing through the streets. Yet, against overwhelming odds, the RAF held strong, aided by radar technology and raw determination, forcing Hitler to abandon his invasion plans and accept that Britain would not fall easily. Still, even as the skies quieted, the world sensed the war's next phase approaching, for Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond Western Europe, and the stage was being set for a conflict even more brutal, vast, and unstoppable, one that would draw in nations across continents, reshape alliances, and push humanity into the deepest abyss it had ever known. The invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, did not remain a regional conflict for long. Within 48 hours, Britain and France declared war on Germany, honoring their promise to defend Polish sovereignty. Yet, while Europe braced for a massive clash, the first months of war were strangely quiet. Newspapers called it the Phony War, a period when armies waited, defensive lines were strengthened, and the world held its breath, knowing the storm was only delayed, not prevented. In April 1940, Hitler shattered the silence. German forces swept into Denmark and Norway, securing strategic ports and iron ore supply routes. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, showed its terrifying strength: fast tanks, coordinated infantry, and overwhelming air attacks that crushed defenses before they could react. By May, the real catastrophe struck. Germany launched an all-out assault on Western Europe, bypassing France's heavily fortified Maginot Line by blitzing through Belgium and the Ardennes Forest, an area once considered impassable. The French and British armies were caught off guard, stunned by the speed and power of the German advance. As German troops encircled Allied forces, hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers found themselves trapped near the French port of Dunkirk. It seemed certain that they would be annihilated. But what followed became one of the most dramatic rescues in military history. A desperate evacuation began. Destroyers, fishing boats, merchant ships, and hundreds of civilian vessels crossed the English Channel under relentless bombardment. Against impossible odds, more than 330,000 soldiers were brought to safety. Britain celebrated the miracle of Dunkirk, but the reality remained grim. Europe was collapsing. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. A week later, France surrendered. Hitler stood triumphant over Western Europe, and Britain now stood alone against the rising Nazi empire. In the summer of 1940, Hitler turned his attention to the skies, launching the Battle of Britain. Waves of Luftwaffe bombers targeted airfields, industrial centers, and eventually civilian cities in an attempt to break British resistance. But the Royal Air Force, armed with radar technology and unwavering determination, refused to yield. The words of Prime Minister Winston Churchill echoed through the nation. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. By October, Germany failed to gain air superiority, and the invasion of Britain was postponed indefinitely. Meanwhile, far from Europe, another storm brewed. In Asia, Japan continued its brutal expansion across China and the Pacific. As Europe burned, Japan prepared to seize the opportunity, and soon, its ambitions would bring the United States into the war. But for now, in late 1940, the world stood at a terrifying crossroads. Hitler's empire stretched from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. Britain fought for survival, and a global conflict was only just beginning to unfold. From 1941 to 1943, World War II transformed from a European conflict into a global war stretching across continents, oceans, and cultures. Germany, having conquered most of Western Europe, launched the massive Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union in June 1941. It was the largest land invasion ever attempted. More than 3 million German soldiers, accompanied by thousands of tanks and aircraft, surged across a front thousands of kilometers wide. Soviet defenses collapsed rapidly in many areas. Entire divisions were surrounded and destroyed. Cities fell in quick succession. Millions of civilians were caught in the middle, facing starvation, bombings, and mass executions carried out by Nazi units. But as German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory, they faced logistical challenges. Supply lines stretched thin across vast, hostile terrain. The weather worsened. By October, rain turned roads into oceans of mud. As temperatures dropped, German soldiers suffered in inadequate uniforms. Engines froze. Weapons malfunctioned. Yet Hitler demanded they push forward to capture Moscow before winter fully set in. The Battle of Moscow became a monumental struggle. Soviet troops and civilians built defensive lines, trenches, and barricades around the capital. Reinforcements from Siberia experienced in winter warfare arrived just in time. When winter hit at 40 degrees Celsius, the Soviet counteroffensive began, pushing the exhausted Germans backward for the first time. This defeat shattered the illusion of Germany's invincibility. Simultaneously in Asia, Japan accelerated its expansion. Motivated by the desire for resources and dominance in the Pacific, Japan executed a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The strike sank battleships, destroyed aircraft, and shocked the United States, which until that moment had remained officially neutral. Overnight, American public opinion shifted. and the U.S. entered the war bringing enormous industrial power, manpower, and technology into the global conflict. With the U.S. now involved, the Pacific War expanded rapidly. Japan captured the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Burma, and numerous islands across the Pacific. The Allies feared Japan might even threaten Australia or India. But the tide turned at the Battle of Midway in 1942, when U.S. naval intelligence anticipated Japanese movements and sank multiple aircraft carriers. From that moment, Japan lost the strategic initiative. U.S. forces began island hopping, capturing key territories and cutting off Japanese supply lines. The brutal campaign in Guadalcanal marked the beginning of Japan's gradual retreat. Back in Europe and North Africa, the war intensified. German U-boats threatened Allied shipping in the Atlantic, sinking thousands of tons of supplies. If Britain lost these supply routes, it would starve. Allied scientists and intelligence officers worked tirelessly, breaking German codes and improving anti-submarine tactics. Gradually, the Allies pushed back the U-boat threat. In North Africa, the legendary German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, led daring attacks that astonished the Allies. But by late 1942, the tide turned. At El Alamein, British forces halted Rommel's advance. Soon after, American and British troops launched Operation Torch, landing in Morocco and Algeria. Squeezed between two Allied armies, Axis forces in Africa ultimately surrendered in 1943. The decisive turning point on the Eastern Front came with the Battle of Stalingrad. German forces, overconfident and stretched thin, attempted to seize the industrial city on the Volga River. Fighting became brutal street-to-street combat. Soviet soldiers vowed that not a single step backward would be taken. As winter set in, the Soviets encircled the German Sixth Army, trapping them in a frozen wasteland without food or ammunition. Hitler refused to allow retreat. Starvation, frostbite, disease, and constant bombardment destroyed the army. In February 1943, the remnants surrendered. Stalingrad became a symbol of Nazi defeat and Soviet resilience. By the end of 1943, it was clear the Axis powers were weakening. Germany faced enormous losses in the east. Japan struggled to maintain its empire, and Italy's morale collapsed. Meanwhile, the Allies, powered by American production and global coordination, began preparing for the eventual liberation of Europe. By 1942, the Axis powers seemed close to victory. Germany dominated Europe, Japan swept across the Pacific, and Italy pushed into North Africa alongside German forces. Yet beneath the surface, pressure was building. The Allies, Britain, the Soviet Union, and now the United States were beginning to coordinate strategy, share intelligence, and mobilize industrial power on a scale the world had never seen. The year 1942 would become the turning point of the war. In North Africa, Axis hopes rested on the genius of German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. His daring maneuvers pushed British forces deep into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal and vital Allied supply routes. But in the summer of 1942, the tide began to shift. At the small railway town of El Alamein, British General Bernard Montgomery launched a massive offensive. After weeks of brutal tank battles, Rommel's advance was halted. Churchill declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." It was the first major Axis setback on land. Meanwhile, across the vast Pacific, the United States Navy struck back. In June 1942, at the Battle of Midway, American code breakers discovered Japan's plan to ambush the U.S. fleet. Forewarned, American carriers launched a daring attack, sinking four of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers, an irreversible blow to Japanese naval power. In a single moment, the balance of the Pacific War shifted. The myth of Japanese invincibility shattered, and the United States began pushing across the Pacific island by island. Yet the most brutal struggle of 1942 unfolded on the Eastern Front. Hitler, obsessed with securing oil fields in the Caucasus, launched a massive summer offensive and ordered his forces toward the city of Stalingrad. What followed became one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The city was reduced to rubble as German and Soviet soldiers fought street by street, building by building, often just meters apart. The Soviets refused to yield. Stalin ordered that not one step back be taken. As winter set in, the Red Army encircled the German Sixth Army, trapping more than 250,000 soldiers. Despite Hitler's demands to fight to the last man, starvation and disease consumed the trapped forces. In February 1943, the remaining German troops surrendered, marking the first major, undeniable German defeat of the war. By the end of 1942, the global situation had dramatically changed. The Allies had won decisive victories in North Africa, the Pacific, and the Eastern Front. The Axis advance was broken, their aura of invincibility gone. Still, the war was far from over. The path to victory would demand even greater sacrifices, and the battles ahead, Sicily, Normandy, Kursk, and the push toward Berlin, would test the world in ways no one could yet imagine. By 1943, the momentum of the war had fully shifted. The Allies, strengthened by shared resources and coordinated strategy, moved from defensive survival to decisive offense. The first major step came in North Africa, where the combined might of American and British forces squeezed the remnants of German and Italian troops. In May 1943, over 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in Tunisia, ending Hitler's presence in Africa. With the Mediterranean secure, the Allies turned their focus to Europe's soft underbelly, Italy. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 stunned the Axis. Within weeks, Mussolini's fascist regime collapsed, Italy signed an armistice, and German forces rushed south to prevent a complete Allied takeover. What followed was a slow, brutal push through Italy's mountains and fortified lines, a campaign that bled both sides but forced Germany to divert precious troops from other fronts. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front exploded with colossal intensity. In the summer of 1943, Hitler launched Operation Citadel, hoping to regain the initiative by striking a massive Soviet-held bulge around the city of Kursk. It became the largest tank battle in world history. Thousands of armored vehicles clashed across fields of fire and smoke. After days of relentless combat, the Soviet lines held. A powerful counterattack drove the exhausted German armies backward, and from that moment on, the Wehrmacht would never again regain the strategic initiative. The Red Army began a relentless march westward, liberating vast territories that had suffered under Nazi occupation. As the Soviet advance accelerated, the Western Allies prepared the most ambitious military operation in history, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. On June 6, 1944 D-Day, over 150,000 Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy under intense fire. The landing succeeded, and within weeks the Allies broke through German defenses and began liberating one French town after another. Paris was freed in August, and by autumn, Allied armies were pushing toward Germany's borders. Hitler responded with desperation, launching a surprise counterattack in December 1944 through the dense Ardennes force, the Battle of the Bulge. For a moment, the German attack created panic, bending Allied lines, but the counteroffensive soon collapsed due to fuel shortages, harsh winter, and fierce resistance. It was Germany's final major offensive. The end was now inevitable. Across the world, Japan fought stubbornly as American forces closed in from island to island. Battles like Saipan, Leyte Gulf, and Iwo Jima showed the brutal cost of Pacific warfare. Soldiers fought to the last breath. Civilians were caught between firestorms and starvation. In early 1945, the United States captured Okinawa after one of the bloodiest campaigns of the war, bringing American bombers within striking distance of Japan's mainland. Meanwhile, in Europe, the final act unfolded. The Soviets encircled Berlin, battling street by street as the city crumbled. Hitler, refusing to surrender, hid in his bunker beneath the ruins. On April 30, 1945, he took his own life. A week later, Germany officially surrendered, ending the war in Europe. Japan, however, fought on. With millions of lives at stake in a potential invasion, the United States made a devastating decision. In August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, unleashing destruction unlike anything the world had ever seen. Faced with unimaginable suffering and total collapse, Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. After 6 years of global conflict, after more than 60 million lives lost, World War II finally came to an end. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world emerged from the ruins into a reality forever changed. Cities across Europe and Asia lay in ash and rubble. Millions were displaced, families torn apart, nations shattered, and entire communities erased. The devastation was unlike anything humanity had ever endured. In the heart of this destruction, the true horror of Nazi crimes was uncovered. As Allied soldiers liberated concentration camps, they found the grim evidence of the Holocaust: millions of Jewish men, women, and children systematically murdered, along with countless others targeted by the Nazi regime. These revelations shocked the world, forcing humanity to confront the darkest depths of its own cruelty. But even amid the grief, a new vision for the future began to take shape. Leaders understood that if the world returned to old rivalries and distrust, another catastrophe was inevitable. To prevent that, nations came together to form the United Nations in 1945, a global institution dedicated to diplomacy, cooperation, and peace. For the first time in history, major world powers agreed to sit at the same table and resolve conflicts before they escalated into war. Hope began to rise from the ashes. Yet, peace did not mean harmony. The end of World War II marked the beginning of a new conflict: the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States, once allies against Hitler, emerged as the world's two superpowers, divided by ideology and mistrust. Europe was split between East and West, symbolized most powerfully by the Iron Curtain. Germany itself was divided, and Berlin became a tense front line in a new global struggle for influence. Instead of open warfare, nations competed through espionage, economic pressure, political influence, and the terrifying race for nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, the end of the war accelerated a wave of independence movements across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Colonies demanded freedom after centuries of foreign rule. Nations like India, Indonesia, and Vietnam began their long journeys towards self-determination. The world map was being redrawn, new countries rising from the wreckage of old empires. In Japan, a country devastated by atomic bombings, a complete transformation began. The U.S. occupation rebuilt its political system, economy, and society. Japan emerged as a peaceful, prosperous nation, rejecting military expansion forever. In Europe, the Marshall Plan provided economic aid to rebuild shattered nations, laying the foundation for future unity and cooperation. These efforts helped turn former battlefields into thriving democracies and economic powerhouses. But the most enduring legacy of World War II was not found in borders or treaties, it was in memory. Survivors, soldiers, and historians carried the lessons of those 6 catastrophic years into the future. The war taught humanity that unchecked hatred leads to genocide, unchecked ambition leads to destruction, and unchecked power leads to tyranny. It showed that freedom is fragile, peace is precious, and unity is stronger than division. By the end of this global tragedy, more than 60 million lives had been lost. Each number was a story, a dream, a family, a future that never came. Their sacrifice reshaped the world and reminded humanity that peace must be protected at all costs. World War II changed everything: nations, borders, ideologies, technology, and the future of global power. It remains a timeless warning and an unforgettable chapter in the story of mankind, one that must be remembered so it is never repeated.